All right, it says the recording has started. All right. All right, everybody, just so to make sure you're in the right session, although I think most people are, I'm basically going to be talking about customizing modern sites, so modern SharePoint sites and teams with SPFx. And so I'll show you guys a couple of cool things we've done. I'll also kind of go through the SharePoint framework, what it is, how it's used, and some general information first. And then the last part of the session, I'll actually be doing demo. I'm actually going to create an SPFx web part, a basic one that works in both Teams and in SharePoint. And I'll deploy that to my tenant, my dev tenant, and just kind of show you how it's all working. And just in case it doesn't work perfectly, I already have one deployed, so I have a backup plan. So make sure everybody can see my screen. I'm sharing my PowerPoint presentation, and they should see the SharePoint framework. Can everybody see that?
Yes, sir.
All right. If anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to jump in, interrupt, talk, raise their hand in Teams, whichever one you want to do. I'm okay with all of those things. I'll keep an eye out for raised hands as I go, and Derek will also do that. All right, so a little bit about me. I'm Bill Felker. I'm a cloud architect at a company called Valorem Reply. We're based out of Kansas City. I happen to live in the St. Louis area, so I am a St. Louis native. I live in the Illinois side of St. Louis, but I'm a St. Louis native. I've actually been doing SharePoint development since 2003, which is really sad that I'm still doing some of it. But what I'm doing now is so much cooler than what we used to do before. So in 2003, I always felt like everything we developed was a hack in Microsoft and the SharePoint world, and so did all the SharePoint admins. But now I feel like what we do is actually a very consistent model, and it's consistent with modern development, which is also a really nice thing. So let me kind of run through the agenda. I'll probably skip the first point. I usually ask a couple of questions about, oh, who's using the SharePoint framework? Who's built this? Who's built that? We don't have enough people in the room, and I think I'll just kind of jump through and start talking about what it is, why we use it. So I'll talk about why, what it is, what types of solutions you can build, some best practices. I've built a lot of web parts with SPFx and a lot of customizations with SPFx. I've deployed into even Microsoft's tenant. So I will talk a little bit about deployments and some best practices there, some tips and tricks. And then at the very end, I will do some demo and some samples. So why use the SharePoint framework? So the SharePoint framework is actually all about the modern development and the modern UX. And so when we're using the modern UX in SharePoint, we're talking about the responsive nature of SharePoint. And so using the SharePoint framework, it allows you to build solutions that actually work with this modern experience and adds a lot of cool capabilities. What is the SharePoint framework? It's basically a page and extension model that enables the client-side development. And so the key there is client-side development. You're not doing server-side development like we did in the old days. It actually facilitates doing the build for SharePoint a lot easier. And then as you'll see with the tooling and some of the open source tooling that we're using on the back end, that it makes it a little more viable in the long run. And speaking of that, the tools that we're going to be using are, and I'll kind of go across, so you'll see like the little icons for it. So this is a Visual Studio Code. This is actually Yeoman, which if you're ever doing client-side, and I'll actually show you this one, I'll actually do a yo command to build. We're using React. React is what Facebook is built on. So the React framework is a JavaScript framework, and it's what Facebook developed to do all of the Facebook development. NPM is basically the node tools to actually help you load all the node modules that you'll use when you build your solutions. And then TypeScript is what it's all converted into when it's actually compiled and built. And so there is a just-in-time type compiler with TypeScript, and you'll see the TS extensions in there when I show you my code window as I do a little bit of coding later. So in practice, you want to see how you can actually build these things. And so when you start, and I usually do a demo early on, I'm going to save all my demos for later, but you'll see me actually run like a yo command. You'll see me I won't do the gulp serve, but I'll show you the gulp commands I use to do a build. And I'll show you like a whole process for building and how you build your application, which goes through some gulp commands. It does the gulp solution deploy, and then I actually do a deployment. And so the deployment is actually putting it in your app catalog and then actually deploying it out into your SharePoint sites or your team sites as you need to. So what kind of different types of solutions you have? So I actually had to change this slide because before it was just web parts. Now it's web parts and team tabs, so I can actually do teams tabs. You can actually build out these solutions so that they're showing up in teams or showing up on SharePoint on a page. And then you can also do things called extensions, which actually enhance the SharePoint experience by you have certain placeholders on the page of a modern SharePoint site that you can add your extensions into. Things like adding a header across the top or a custom footer across the bottom. And in the header, you can do different things. I have a client right now that says, hey, we love these new modern sites and they're great. And we love, the ability to do hub sites, but we want a navigation to put across all of our sites, whether it's a hub site or not. How can we do that? Well, the answer is a SharePoint, an SPFx extension. So I'm putting together an SPFx extension for them that adds a mega menu across the tops because it's even going across the tops of hub sites. So just kind of give you an idea of how those are built and why. So when we get into web parts, you can see that they're native client-side solutions. So they're JavaScript solutions. And it's all worrying about, making sure that you build your stuff correctly. And you're not going to upset your SharePoint admins, or in this case, it's all online. So you're upsetting Microsoft. Page context and the DOM. So, it's not like iframes popping into your page. These are actually real solutions, with the page context loading into your DOM of your page. They're framework agnostic. I mentioned React is the one that is used beyond the back of the background, but Angular, Knockout, or anything, it says, or nothing, but I meant anything. So you can use any one of the frameworks to actually build your code. Most of the samples that you'll see from Microsoft actually use React as their base. They don't use Angular, probably just because it's a Google product. But you'll see a lot of them that are samples and stuff done in React. Modern web development practices. So this is kind of the best part about this is it's a complete retooling. They didn't use, you're not using your classic Visual Studio in your deployments into the old solution sets that were deployed before. These are not the add-ins that you had before either. These are actually custom solutions that are deployed, all JavaScript based and all client-side based. So it's actually a modern tooling that most modern developers, even like young developers, can actually use their modern tools that they're used to using in building these solutions. Extensions, I kind of mentioned what some of these are, and I mentioned the top one the most. So application customizers, they're actually used to add scripts on the page or to, placeholders, like the top and the bottom. Field customizers, they actually provide modified views to data and fields from within a list. So you can actually customize the way your fields show up in your site. And then command sets just extend the SharePoint command surfaces. So if you want to think about when I'm looking at a SharePoint library and I get the little ellipsis, I can actually extend those commands and add commands into the ellipsis by doing some custom command sets. And those are all the things that extensions can manage. So a little bit about best practices. So when you start to build a new project and using the SharePoint framework, I highly recommend that you go and get the latest framework, version, because it can make a big difference, especially when you're deploying into a large company and how things can work like that. Include all the assemblies you may be using. And some things I always think of that people always forget is the Fabric UI. And using some of the React Fabric UI, which means that I can have a more consistent feel with Microsoft's feels or the way they look and feel on things. So if I use the Fabric UI, I get that same look that Microsoft's using inside of their SharePoint or their team sites. I recommend using a code repository, which doesn't mean just a folder on your desktop. I like to use Azure DevOps with Git as the back end. And usually this is not for demos and purposes like that, but I use Git when I'm actually developing code for a client. I like to do that and use Git on the back end for that. Always plan for testing and deploying, especially if you're deploying into a large company. Some of the deployment practices may not be what you're used to, where I'm just dragging and dropping apps into the app count. Yeah, it's deployed. You probably won't be able to do that in a large company. They'll probably have a process for deploying apps and reviewing code. So just know that that is something that your code will probably be reviewed. So make sure that your code is clean, and you're not just writing junk and putting junk out there for them to review. Some tips and tricks. Find and remove all outdated packages. So one of the things that happens is if I create a solution, or let's say I find a solution from Microsoft or from GitHub that kind of meets my needs, but I need to tweak it a little bit. When you bring that solution in, what you may want to do is actually go in and, there's a way to find all your outdated packages in your NPM. And so using Node, you can actually find all the outdated packages and then update them. Now, I will say there are some conflicts when you do this. And so some things can break when you start to update packages and now something else broke because it's the wrong version. So you may have to do a couple rounds of that. And I've had to do that in the past. Like I recommended earlier, using the Office UI Fabric and Fabric React allows you to get the same look and feel and experience that you would get in Microsoft. Put all components into one solution to deploy. So if you're deploying a solution into a customer, for instance, if it's Microsoft as your customer, and you're having a couple custom web parts, and then you're also going to build an extension. If you put all of that into one solution versus deploying it as 3 separate solutions, all your node modules are now combined into one node module folder versus having 3 of them. And node module folders are notoriously large and also notoriously having hundreds of thousands of files. So if you think about that, if I create 3 separate solutions, 3 separate deployment packages, I have 3 different areas in my development environment that had over 100,000 files in them. So this can be a problem as you're, looking at your space on your own computer. Leverage the property pane. So as you're doing web parts and things like that, as you're deploying, can't really do it for custom extensions, but for a web part, let the users be able to select some of the properties that they want to choose. And so I can actually show one of these property panes on a solution that's deployed in my own dev environment. So we can talk about that as we get there. Utilize examples from PNP or Microsoft. So again, these are some of the ones that I talk about that are on GitHub that allow you to actually get a starting place. A lot of them are not fully developed and fully set up to say, hey, this is a production piece. Usually you have to go in and modify them. And if you're going to modify them and deploy them onto your site, what I recommend is changing all the GUIDs in case someone down the line takes that same solution and tries to deploy it over the top, but it's your custom one, and then the out of the box one gets deployed over the top. It can cause some collisions in the deployment. The deployment for them will fail. The second one will fail. So if you do get a solution from Microsoft, it's always a good idea to change the GUIDs, and I'll even show you where those GUIDs are in the code window when we get there. And again, if anybody has any questions along the way, jump in. Feel free to interrupt. I'm not scared to answer questions as we go through this. So deploying and updating your solution. So steps for deploying, you package your solution using, there's a gulp command called package-solution. I'll show you all of this as we go through it. You add the package to the app catalog. And again, this is all if you're deploying it to your own computer or your own SharePoint site. And you have access to do that. If you don't have access to that, you have to get your package, send it to the person who can add it to the app catalog. They have to trust the solution. And I say this, but sometimes that trust solution doesn't even pop up. If you're the admin and you're deploying it, the trust solution doesn't even pop up anymore. Go to the site collection you want to get it deployed to, and then add the app to your site. You'll see that this is one way of doing it, but there is another way of deploying where you can deploy across all sites. There's a little checkbox for that, and you have to actually set your app up to do that. And so when I do the demo where I show how to build an app, I'll set that setting so it deploys across, because if you don't do that, you can't deploy to Teams. And again, I'll bring it up when we get there too. And then add the web part to your page, and I'll show you exactly what that looks like as we go through this. To update your solution is a little more interesting because you have to make the changes to your solution. I always recommend, if you're going to make a pretty good change to your solution, you're not just changing one little CSS file, modifying the version number in the package solution JSON file. What this does is it updates the solution so that you're at the next version, and they can always roll back if they need to on versions. So it helps if it's all the same version getting deployed, makes it a lot harder to roll back that version. Then you have to rebuild the package, and there's a whole step for that. And it's using gulp commands, and I'll actually run those gulp commands today in Visual Studio Code so you can actually see them. Then you add the package to the app catalog, just like you did before. If you have to trust, you trust the solution again. Go to the site collection that it's deployed in, and then you have to do an update your app. Especially if you update the version, you'll see that you can do the update. Now, what's interesting is a lot of times when you do that update, it says, oh, in order to do that, I have to go to the classic mode. And so it actually pops back to the classic mode of SharePoint to do the update or to do a remove. And then it allows you to do that. And then you can go back to the modern SharePoint look. And it's just something that Microsoft hasn't finished releasing yet, where that's all just using the modern. All right, so let's get into some of this fun stuff. So I'm going to go straight to my demo. So we'll end the slideshow for right now. I will dismiss my meeting invite. And then I'm going to pop open the command window and drag it over here. So you'll see that I've already preset my development environment up. And so there's some things you have to do in your development environment to set it up. And it's mostly about going through and setting up things like, installing gulp, installing node, and doing some of those installs in your development environment. Installing Visual Studio Code so you have a coding thing. You don't have to use Visual Studio Code. You can do it all from the command line, but I'll show you using Visual Studio Code is actually a really, probably an easier way to manage things as you go. So everybody can still see my command window, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, I was waiting for someone to say. All right, so when you do this, and I talked about, I'm already in my command window, and I said I would actually be putting in a yo command. So you'll see that the very first command that I'm going to pop in is a uman. So yo's short for uman. I'm going to do the @Microsoft SharePoint. And what this is actually going to do is what's going to be called building the scaffolding of my solution. So the scaffolding is all the node modules, all the build out that I would need to actually say I'm going into. William's asking about font size. Is it kind of small? You need it bigger? It might be a little bit harder in the command window, but I will only be in I'll only be in this command window for a few minutes. And so it's going to be small while I'm in the command window. So just bear with me for a minute while I do the command window. And then after that, I'll blow up everything so you can see it better. So once I run this @Microsoft SharePoint command, and I'm going to go ahead and hit enter because this one takes a little bit longer to run and even to start up. Hopefully my computer is going to be fast today. And while this is running, I'll start to talk through what it's going to do on the back end. So it's going to be building out the whole scaffolding of my solution. So it's going to be building out, the SharePoint pieces of it as it goes through. There it goes. Now it's starting. So it's saying, welcome to the SharePoint Client Connector Solution Generator. What is your solution name? And I'm actually not going to change my name because I created it as Teams tab. So then you get the choice, and I'll read all these out so you can hear them too. Which packages do you want to use? So I can use SharePoint Online only, SharePoint 26 up, which would include 2019 and SharePoint Online, or just SharePoint 2019, which includes SharePoint Online. I only do SharePoint Online right now because that's what I'm doing. And then it asked me whether or not I want to use the current folder or to create a subfolder. So I'm just going to say the current folder. Do you want to allow the tenant admin the choice of being able to deploy the solution to all sites immediately without running the feature deployment and adding apps in the sites? The answer to this one is yes. And the reason why is because it allows me to deploy to Teams just by syncing. Will the components in the solution require permissions to access web API? So if you're trying to access other things outside of the solution, so things like using the graph, the Microsoft graph or things like that, you would have to say yes to this. In my case, I'm not going to. It is going to be a web part. It gives me the, whether I want to do a web part, an extension, or a library. I say a web part. What is your web part name? I do not want it to be Hello World. I want it to be Teams tab. What is your web part description? And that works just fine for me. And then so you have a choice of which framework you would like to use. And so you can use no JavaScript framework or React. I'm actually not using anything that's special with React at this point in time. So I'm going to say no JavaScript framework. And then it's going to start chugging along and start adding things and building out my node modules as I go. So I'm going to let this run. And so it's going to kick out here for a minute. It actually ran pretty fast yesterday, so let's see how fast it goes today. And everything it's doing here is actually looking at for all the modules that I might need to do SharePoint and to get some of the core things in there for the SharePoint deployment and development. You can't hear it, but my computer is sounding like a little jet airplane getting ready to take off. So it does that every time you do one of these NPM installs. It actually will run and actually run for a little bit to build up all those modules. Remember, I talked about 100,000 files being built. That's what it's doing right now. It's actually building out all of the files that I would need to run SharePoint. And I'm going to let this run out because I want to show you some of the really cool little quick commands you can do to actually get into things as it's finishing up here. So Kirk, glad to see you joined as well. And Frank, you joined as well. I guess Becky's on here now too. So a bunch of new people came in while I was talking. So a show of hands, and everybody knows how to do the show of hands inside of Teams, I hope. Who has actually built a SharePoint framework web part? Well, Becky, of course, I knew that. All right, so everybody else is new and is a rookie. This is great. So I'm glad I'm showing you from the beginning in because I think that'll help kind of guide you through theirs. So one of the things I'm going to do, so now if the solution's actually built, so actually if I look into this, if I look into the folder that this is created in, I could see everything that it already built for me. But I like to do that when I use Visual Studio Code. So remember the tool set that I showed earlier. So now what I'm going to do is actually go into Visual Studio Code. So the way to get there from a command window, if I'm already in the folder that the solution was deployed into, I could just type code dot. And what that'll open up is Visual Studio Code. And so you can see it popped up Visual Studio Code for me in the Teams tab, and it actually built out everything I need. So when I talked about the node modules, when I expand that, you can see all the node modules in here already. We'll talk about the config file. I mentioned when you do an update, you need to update this package solution.json. You'll notice that it starts with a version 1.0.0.0. When I was doing deployments, I was able to increment this at the lowest level all the way up to like a 2.0 level as we were doing builds. As I get into the solution, you can see that, besides the node modules, it does produce a source. And so I have my web parts, which I said it was a web part. And you'll see that I have the Teams tab webpart.ts. And I talked about TypeScript was being used. So the TS file is a TypeScript file. You'll notice that because it's a modern development solution, it automatically puts in this Teams folder. This actually holds the pictures and the outline pictures and the color pictures for your solution to go into a Teams tab. And what this means is if I wanted a custom icon or something like that for my solution, I would actually put this in there and I could update the pictures. Now, note that the picture has to be this same name because this is my solution. And so this GUID identifies my solution. So if I don't have it as this name, so what I'd basically have to do is take these, update the picture to be whatever I wanted it to be, and then save it as that name and put it in my solution so it could get packaged up. But in order for this to be both SharePoint and Teams, I have to make a couple of changes to the out-of-the-box solution. So you see this Teams tab web part, manifest.json. And so it's the manifest for the TS file. I have to come in here. And in here, you'll see that it's actually, make sure I did the right place. There it is. So I knew that. So in here, you have to actually allow it to be in, you can see that it's a SharePoint web part only right now. But if I put a comma into here, and I can actually do another one, I did it in the wrong spot. do a comma in there, and now I can put a quote in here. Now you'll see that it's going to give me other options, a full page, a personal app, or a Teams tab. So I want to do a Teams tab because it allows me to build a Teams tab with this solution as well. So now this makes it team enabled. Now, all I've done is saying that now it can be deployed to a team. There's nothing custom I've done that says, hey, if this is a certain way, to show it a different way. So what I want to do is make those changes just so you can see that it looks a little different, whether it's deployed into a team or into a SharePoint site. So if you look into the code of the Teams tab web part that's already pre-built for me, you'll see that it's importing a bunch of stuff at the top. But down here, you can see that it's actually just putting something when it does the render command and how it renders on the page. It's just putting some stuff out there, welcome to SharePoint, customize the SharePoint experience using web parts, blah, blah, blah. So what I want to do is actually change this a little bit because I want it to be a little bit different. So I'm going to add a couple little lines of code, and I'm going to do a couple at a time here as I go through this. So there, I'm first going to name some variables, title, subtitle, and subtitle tab. And then I'm actually going to set those based off of whether it's a Microsoft Teams or whether it's SharePoint. So the first time I deployed this, it was pretty awesome, is I put this code in and then I didn't change this inner HTML code. And so I couldn't figure out why in Teams it was showing welcome to SharePoint. And then I realized, oh, I wasn't actually using my variables. And so I actually had to switch that to use my variables. So then I captured this code here in. And so now what it's doing is saying that, basically change the experience so that I'm in Teams, using the context that is the Microsoft Teams. It'll put in the title that is Teams, welcome to Teams. Otherwise, it'll actually put the title in for SharePoint, which is the welcome to SharePoint. So now I've done all this, and here's another mistake I made, is I saved this one. So I said file save. But you remember, I made a change to this other Teams tab manifest web part, and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't deploy to Teams, because I actually have to save this file too before I can continue. So I click save. And now what you can do is you can actually run this all from here and build out the solution. So you'll see me go into open up a new terminal window. And you'll see that there's errors. And the errors are fine because what it's saying is there's no relation to this yet. So as soon as I do a gulp command for build, you'll see me do something interesting here. If I do a -ship, it means I can actually deploy the package to anywhere I want to do it. If I'm just going to try to deploy it locally and I'm going to do a quick deploy, I can use the gulp serve. But in this case, I'm going to build it. I'm going to drop it out there so I can deploy it out to Microsoft Teams as well. So I'm doing a gulp build -ship. Now, I generally do a build and then a bundle. So you'll see me do the gulp build. This will take a second to run. And I said a second. Takes a little bit to run and kick up and get started. And once it does, then you can see it doing a couple of things. And I got a couple of errors, which is interesting, probably because I didn't do something right. Error property, my first Teams tab. And of course, this is awesome that I'm getting an error on this one. I'm sure it's in this code that I copied and pasted in. Yep. Yeah, that's why. That'll fix that. So that's why we do that. Then I do a gulp build -ship. One more time, and then now I won't get the same errors. I got a different error. Oh, lesson learned. Save. If you don't save, it's not going to work. Even if you've done it 100 times, you'll still get the same errors along the way that you get every time you do it. So now it went clean. So then I do a gulp bundle. And what this does is it bundles up all of the TS files, kind of packages it. Now it doesn't build the package to actually do the solution. The fact that I'm typing these commands in and I've done it like 100 times, so I know what I'm doing. So now it's bundled. So everything's pre-built, ready to actually get ready to do the deploy. So now I have to do the gulp package -solution. And then I add the -ship so that it says I can actually deploy it out to other places. So this means that I could take the same solution and deploy it anywhere I wanted to deploy it. So it could be in my tenant, could be in a different tenant. So that's what allows me to do that. And this uses the package dash solution JSON file to get the correct versions, to get the name of the package and things like that. So I'm going to run this. This one doesn't take as long. And it's done. And then I'm going to go find that solution. So when I go to my code window, and I'll pull this open here, I'm going to go to my Teams tab. And this is where all my code lives. I'm going to go to the SharePoint folder, and I'm going to go to my solution. So here's my Teams tab, SPFx, which means it's a SharePoint package file. And just to show you that it's there, I'm going to move that out of the way, because now I'm going to open up my dev tenant. And I've got a lot of stuff deployed here, just so you know. There's a lot of code that I've deployed along the way to this one. So I'm going to actually take that Teams tab, SharePoint package, and I'm just going to drop it in. And this was that little checkbox that I said you have to check in order to get this out to Teams. I have to say deploy it to all the sites in my organization. If I don't deploy it to all the sites in my organization, it means that it can't actually be deployed to Teams, because I have to be able to deploy it in the back end this way. Now, once that's deployed, I have to go find it. There's my Teams tab client side. So if I click this guy, you'll see that above the top, I can do the deploy, but what it really allows me to do is to sync to Teams. So when I sync to Teams now, you can see that it says successfully synced Teams solution. Now I'm going to wait a second or two before I just go in and say, hey, let's add this in. So when I'm in Microsoft Teams, and I'm all doing this through the browser, so you can see that I can use the browser for everything, including I'm presenting through the browser as well. When I look in my tabs or my apps, and I want to do, you can see that I already created one called Hello World, but I'm going to do see if it's out there yet. I don't see it yet, but I'm gonna guess that it's actually out there. So let me go into my general tab here and click my tab. And so I see my Hello World, but I don't see my Teams tab. And like I said, this sometimes takes a little bit to actually come into play, and it's not there yet. So I'll show you how you can add the Hello World one, which was another one that I deployed yesterday as a backup plan. So if I add this Hello World in, you can say I can post to the channel about this tab, and I can click save. And when it loads up, you can see I can change the description to say, so this is that property pane I talked about, being able to use that so people can change the custom code as they do it. So now in the Hello World, it's welcome to Teams. Remember, I made those changes to the code that said whether it was a Teams or whether it was SharePoint. So here is my solution that I deployed here. But just to prove out that this actually works pretty much anywhere you want to go, I'm going to refresh my site that I'm working in. And I only do that to make sure that I'm not logged out and I have issues there. I'm actually going to close that. Sorry. I'm going to edit the page. I'm going to go right here. And I'm going to go in, and all I'm going to do is type hello. And so now I can see my Hello World SharePoint app. And there it is. Welcome to SharePoint. Customize the SharePoint experiences using web parts. We're in the context of the following site, committee team site. And so then if I change the description by going to the property pane to say, I can manage that. Now it's in there. And then when I republish the page, my web part's in there, and I continue through. So as you can see, I was able to actually deploy it to both places as a Teams tab or a SharePoint solution, which means that if I have a SharePoint solution that I'm developing, and think about the bigger picture, I just did the Hello World, but you could easily do one that is, a custom solution that your employees need to use. They can use it on a SharePoint site, or they can actually use it as a Teams tab, and it gives them the power to actually not have to leave Teams. And I have that same solution deployed into both places, so it works in both places. So I do want to show one more solution off that was kind of an interesting one along the way. So I'm going to open up a new SharePoint site. And of course, I don't happen to have it loaded up here. I always hope that I do. Duplicate that tab. I have to guess what my new one is every time I do this. So that's the one I was looking for. So this is actually a solution that we did for Microsoft, and I have it deployed into my dev. It's not the same exact as what's finally deployed into Microsoft's area, but we actually deployed a solution into Microsoft's website. And so you can see this actually pulls in some of their custom, sessions for the MTC. So Jay, who was on here earlier, works at the MTC, but this was a way for them to do a search and find their MTC categories and content that they can then present at the MTC. So it really just is a massive search. And so I do use Microsoft or SharePoint search to pull in the right content. So these cards, which are called adaptive cards, and using the grid. So again, I'm using the React framework here to actually build the cards using the React card library. And this grid that they're laid out in is called the grid from React. So again, it's using all the same components that Microsoft uses. If you've seen some of the web parts that Microsoft has produced for the home pages where they have the highlighted parts that have the cards, same type of format, but it's a custom solution deployed there. So we can filter down using the different kind of filters that we want. And since I don't really know what I have going on here, I am going to test one thing that I should know. You can see that it narrows down the solutions to which ones are there. We can clear all the filters and I get back to everything, but it was a way for them to find their content and then to click into it. And of course, it would take me to a custom file if there was one there, but it's a really nice, easy solution to display really a lot of deep content as we go. Any questions so far about anything I've talked about or the deployment or anything like that along the way of SPFx web parts? All right. I don't think there's any questions. Is there anything anybody would like me to show other than what I've already shown? Because I'll let everybody off even a little bit earlier than I had hoped. I didn't think my presentation would take more than 45 minutes, but I'm down to 37. So does anybody else have any questions or anything like that? Or do we want to just go ahead and let everybody have another couple minutes back to take a drink break, another coffee break before they go to their next session?
Bill, I don't see anything in the chat. If we don't have any further questions or anybody has any other discussion, we'll go ahead and wrap up the recording now. Again, appreciate you presenting, Bill. Again, always a great presentation when you're involved. We'll go ahead and stop this recording and we will give some people time back for the next session.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Derek.